So Amy, she is currently one of the co-chairs of the Board of Ordained Ministry. So I've gotten to know Amy a bit through that, serving on the board with her. I also had the joy of being in conversation with her way back when she was working on her doctorate. She has a doctorate in preaching. That's not even remotely intimidating for the rest of us pastors. But she was specifically interested in women preaching and just some nuances of that. So she did some great interviews, and I got to be a part of that. So if you ever pick up her book and want some light reading, you can read through that, and you can try and guess which stories are mine, because some of them are in there. It's great fun. But Amy has also taught at Wesley. She's taught a class on worship there. She, as a part of that, has done some classes on funerals and weddings as well. So she has graciously agreed to come and share a little bit of her insights on that with us, to talk to us a little bit about the theology of marriage. She also currently serves at Grace United Methodist Church up in Baltimore County. She's in the city.
But only by half a mile.
There you go, half a mile, right on the line. But Grace has been a reconciling congregation since 2010. So she has some insights from that process as well. So very glad that you're here. Thank you for your willingness to share your wisdom and your time. And it's all yours.
I want to thank Jen and Scott for the invitation to be with you. It's always a pleasure to be with other sister congregations here in the Baltimore Washington Conference. And Jen told you some pieces about me, so I will not repeat them, but Jen was a wonderful colleague on the Board of Ordained Ministry when we served together for, I think, nearly 8 years, maybe only 6 or 7. So this is my plan. I wanted to walk through a theology of marriage, and then I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about grace, and then let's leave plenty of time for conversation. So let's get started. What comes to mind when you think about marriage? Let's shout it out. What do you think? Pardon me?
Frivolous dresses.
Frivolous dresses. Maybe like really fancy dresses, right?
Yeah.
Frivolous, though. I like the word. Other thoughts? What comes to mind in marriage? Go for it.
Hard work.
Hard work. Absolutely. Marriages are hard work. Many of these pictures are about wedding. Look, another idea. What do you think? You think of children?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Often with marriage comes children, and in fact, in the earliest parts of the Christian faith, the commitment to being open to children was even a part of a wedding liturgy. There was a question that would be asked by couples as to whether or not they would be open to whatever children God blessed them to. Some of these pictures are about weddings. We often spend a lot of time talking about weddings. Today we're going to talk about marriage, what we're vowing to and moving into when we come to a Christian marriage. And as I said that, I'm trying to say, what could be distinctly Christian about a marriage? How does our Christian theology inform how we understand and think about marriage? Marriage is based in part in the scriptures, and it draws from several different scriptures. One, of course, would be Genesis. So in that first chapter of Genesis, God creates humankind. God tells them to be fruitful and multiply. I listed Genesis 1 up there, which is often what we cite, but in Genesis 2, the second story of creation, there's a point where God looks at Adam and says, it is not good for Adam to be alone. That this notion that we are made for a relationship with one another, that we need each other, and that marriage becomes a gift of companionship, becomes from the very beginning of the creation story. Next, 1 Corinthians 13, the famous love passage. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. We often read this text at weddings, even though it is written by Paul to be part of a Christian community. But it becomes one of the ways in which we imagine the love that happens in marriage, in part because we hear it so often. When it gets yoked to weddings. And then 1 John 4, 7 through 13, is where the writer of this letter speaks about if we love one another, that love is always of God. Let us love one another because the love comes from God and gets perfected in us. God's love is perfected in us when we love one another. Part of the theology of Christian marriage is the notion that we get better at loving as we go on, that it gets perfected in us. Two more. One is Ephesians. Ephesians is also a text that gets listed as a potential text in weddings. And this is where Paul writes that I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. There every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Now again, this can often be taken to talk about Christian community, but these notions of humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, and being unified get woven into marriage. And then lastly, the second chapter of John's Gospel, where there is a wedding in Cana of Galilee, where Jesus goes with his mother, and somewhat reluctantly, depending on how you interpret the scripture, turns water into wine. John ends the story by saying this is the first of Jesus' signs. So we have this notion of Jesus being present in weddings and blessing them. All of these scriptures hover in the background and help inform a distinctly Christian understanding of marriage. So, Christian marriage is rooted in the theological narrative of creation, incarnation, and redemption. What does that mean? The theological narrative of creation, incarnation, and redemption. Just briefly, what that means is A, it's rooted in God's creation of all of us. 2, incarnation of fleshly life. God is revealed to us in the flesh of our bodies. So marriage, a very fleshly, earthly commitment of bodies to one another. God is revealed in that. And then redemption. Marriages should be transformative. The hope and view, the hope and possibility is that our marriages teach us something about God, about ourselves, and they move us closer to one another and to God. The marriage relationship serves as a witness to God's covenantal love to humankind. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more in a second, but this notion of God's covenant to all of humanity and how that gets worked out in a marriage is really the key to a distinctly Christian view of marriage. And both of these come from a book by Robert Song called Covenant and Call. I want to offer one more set of his really high-level thinkings about marriage. And this comes from an Orthodox theologian, and I will tell you from my own studies, the Orthodox Church has some really beautiful things to say about marriage. In the Orthodox Church, a marriage is a sacrament, which is not true in the Protestant traditions, but they root it in the notions of Christ linked to his church, which we also do, and the notion of sacrifice. And I myself have been really helmed by some of the writings, such as this one, where we talk about marriage as sacrificial, grounded in fidelity and commitment, intended to be lifelong, grounded in mutuality and equality, and a monogamous relationship gifted by the goodness of human sexuality. So just a quick little point that sacrificial, commitment, lifelong, mutual, and grounded in the goodness of sexuality. So for our purposes today, I wanted to talk about three different parts, three different ways of thinking about the kind of essential pieces of Christian marriage. One is commitment. The second is mutual self-giving. And the third is faith. So what makes it a distinctly Christian understanding of marriage? Commitment, mutual self-giving, and faithfulness. It's not true that it's also quite true that other traditions, other faith traditions would have very similar pieces. But this is what I see as distinctly Christian and an embracing of marriage in our Christian faith. So let's unpack these. Commitment. The notion of commitment is rooted in the covenantal nature of God's relationship with us. So we think about God calling Abraham and Sarah and saying, I have promises that I will make to you and to future generations. And that covenant is not needing our response, and yet also continuing to flow out of God's goodness even when we falter. So this notion of God's covenant, God's faithfulness with humankind, grounds our capacity to make faithful commitments to others. God has offered it to us, which gives us the power to offer it to another. It also emerges from our baptismal theology. Again, it's a similar claim of God's claim on us at baptism, and interspersed with the notion of adding to it the presence of Christ. That we die and rise with Christ, and we move into this life of always being refined and coming closer to God, in a covenant that is sustained by a power greater than us. So we link the covenant that God gives to Abraham and Sarah and all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures to the being sealed in Christ that comes in baptism. So we think of marriage as a lifelong bond that is always growing, that enables a couple to be a living icon of God's love to all. In our finite covenantal relationships, we bear witness to the eternal covenant relationships that are held within the very being of God. Trait number 2, a mutual self-giving. Both of those words are important. One is the notion of mutuality. Our Methodist heritage, as well as Christian theology in general, does make the claim that marriage is a marriage of two equal partners. And there were other times earlier, centuries ago, where that mutuality could not be as expressly affirmed. But if you look within our United Methodist doctrinal, social principles, or statements about who we are, we affirm this equality, that both partners in a marriage are equally essential and and coming together as equal partners. And with that is the notion of self-giving, that what makes a marriage grow and thrive is the willingness to have your partner know you, to be known by them, and also to allow your partner to help you know more about yourself, reflect back their experience of you. One of my favorite preachers that talks about this in the marriage sermon as the unveiling. That there's been a long tradition in weddings where a bride is unveiled, but that what actually happens in the marriage is that both partners are willing to lay aside anything that covers the fullness of who they are from being seen by someone else. Drawn to each other, spouses bring into their marriage the gift of their self that has all its wonders and talents and gifts. And they also bring their brokenness, their limitations, their weaknesses. But through an ever-deepening process of interpersonal connection, they render themselves open, and they grow and they change. And they know the joy of being known. As part of, to me, what also makes it distinctively Christian, we think of God's knowing of us and claiming of us. We can experience that in an intimate relationship too. It's part of how we can be Christ to one another. In addition to that image of unveiling, another theologian, Philip Mamalikas, talks about the notion of always wanting to turn towards your partner. He says it can be a difficult choice to turn towards at all times, but he frames it as how those mundane interactions of daily life are spaces where we have to turn to each other. When we ask, are you coming home for dinner? What do you want for your birthday? Who's going to help figure out this laundry tonight? Those sort of spaces where we turn towards each other, and those mundane pieces become spaces of intimacy, of knowing our weaknesses and our strengths and our capacity to rely on someone else. Now, to push it even farther is the notion that marriage has a sacrificial aspect to it. What we mean by that is in the image of Christ's sacrifice for us that leads to resurrection and new life, the capacity to offer ourselves in deeply self-giving ways to our partner can lead to resurrection and new life. Our Orthodox brothers and sisters embody this in a wedding ceremony by putting crowns on the heads of both the bride and the groom. They each wear a crown during the service, and the crown has a dual purpose. On one hand, it names them king and queen for the day, but it also is like the crown of thorns of Jesus. That notion of being willing to know that a piece of marriage is managing through and working through the harder pieces, the tougher stuff. And then at times that will feel like sacrifice, and will actually be a sacrifice. That makes sense? I see some nods. Commitment, mutual self-giving, and faithfulness. Spouses commit to a central relationship with one another and an exclusive sexual union. This fidelity enables trust and deepens affections. I'm speaking specifically here about sexual fidelity and the notion that in a marriage, the gift of God to express ourselves physically is enjoyed, and it deepens mutual companionship and knowing. And I'm just going to quote again from one of the theologian I named at the very beginning. He says here that the sexual life of a couple is more than physical activity. Because the human body is an unfleshed spirit, the experiences of sexuality involve the whole person. Here, couples can communicate with each other their innermost feelings, affections, and hopes. Their very person. It's a soulful space as well as a physical one. We think in Scripture, we often talk about sexual intimacy in Scripture is often referred to as knowing. And here you can see the link back to that mutual self-giving, that the capacity to know, to fully know and be known, and a willingness to let that be a part of that relationship. All of these parts, this touch and vulnerability and rendering love to one another become places where we participate in divine grace. So the notion that our faithfulness is a participation in divine grace with all of our bodies is central to our understanding of marriage. Now, related to this faithfulness is fruitfulness, and I want to just name it in two ways. One, of course, is that an outgrowth of commitment, mutuality, and faithfulness is an openness to life being expanded, specifically an openness to children. That procreation, in the earliest formations of marriage within the Christian faith, one of its primary purposes was procreation, was the creation and care for children. But that's not the only way fruitfulness happens in marriage, right? Because being partnered with someone who knows you, loves you, supports you, enables the other partner to be in service to other facets of the world in their life. So we can think about fruitfulness as being able to be hospitable or generate life through a vocation. And one of the core pieces of our United Methodist liturgy, one of the prayers at the very end, prays that the couple about to be married find their spaces of service in the larger world. So this is expectation that marriage is not just about the two people who are being married, but enables them to then give of themselves more deeply and greatly into the love. Right. Just a couple more things. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm almost done. Two other pieces of marriage that I would want to name for us is that there is a church dimension of marriage. And we call this the ecclesial dimension. Because marriage derives its essential character from baptism and God's covenantal life with us, it becomes intimately related to the faith community. So its primary context is ecclesial. It's not a private affair and an individual affair. It's an event of the church. It's a space where we can share the lives and values of our faith within the context of our homes, but also with one another. So with the witness of the Christian church enables marriages to let aside those models where they're founded on self-satisfaction or finding the perfect mate and those consumeristic tendencies that we've named about weddings. The church's witness can become part of the ecclesial dimension of a marriage. And then separately, the Christian marriage has a sacramental quality. Protestant churches not only recognizes two sacraments, as I'm sure you know, baptism and Holy Communion. Our Orthodox and Catholic sisters and brothers name marriage as a sacrament. I like to believe that marriage has a sacramental dimension. What is a sacrament? It's a space where God is known to us in the ordinary pieces of life, in the daily parts, the sign and symbol of God's grace all around us. Marriage has the capacity to make God's grace present to us, to teach us more about God's faithfulness, God's commitment to us. Is a space that has sacramental dimensions. And for all these reasons, then, marriage is transformational. It becomes a vehicle of God's grace for a couple and for the world around them. You all are, this is not a gathering for a Wesley class on worship, so I'll just say this really quickly, but what I like to do is see how that theology gets played out in the liturgy. So if you remember a wedding that you've attended, or your own wedding, if you're going to open up the book of worship, and the hymnal, the marriage services on the front, you'll see that we say we're gathered here in the sight of God to witness and bless the joining together of these two people in Christian marriage. We name it as a covenant that was established by God, who created us for each other. Remember, God said, it is not good for you to be alone. With his presence and power, Jesus graced a wedding at Cana of Galilee, and in his sacrificial love, gave us the example of the love of husband and wife. These two persons come to give themselves to one another in this holy covenant. See how all that theology gets packed in to those first 5 sentences that a minister says in a wedding. You also can see the same theology in the vows that are exchanged. I take you to be my spouse, to have and to hold. There's a tender, vulnerable, physical piece to that part. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, for sickness and in health. It's a lifelong commitment. Whatever comes, I'm here to love and to cherish, to offer the covenantal love and sacrificial giving until we are parted by God. So all that theology gets played out in the liturgies that we use. So, this is the question that Grace asked itself as it began to discern our own marriage policy. How are we witnessing to the qualities of commitment, mutual self-giving, and faithfulness? And specifically, if we believe that these are deep elements that are essential to marriages, is there anything about that that is specific to a marriage only of a man and a woman? But can all of us, in whatever forms we partner, witness to commitment, mutual self-giving, and faithfulness? And we came to a space where we answered yes. That the deepest part of the theology of marriage is God's covenant with us and our willingness to commit, to live in that kind of covenantal life, to be both faithful and mutual in our giving to one another. And that was kind of the journey for us to moving to a different, and what we now call our open marriage policy. And so, okay, I'll just shift a little bit and talk a little bit about that. So Grace, the roots of Grace's marriage policy came out of a long history of the church and being a space that was open to our gay brothers and sisters. And it really started in the 80s. In the 80s, Grace had a couple of different church members who had personal experiences in their extended networks with people who were living with HIV and AIDS. So this is the 80s. This is when the disease is very scary, and lots of people are getting kicked out of all kinds of institutions for it. And Grace moved towards ministering to people with AIDS. We began a ministry connected to Hopkins infectious disease floor. That created a space where Grace became quietly known as a sanctuary space for people of all different gender expressions. And then we moved into the 2000s as the reconciling movement became more widespread in the Baltimore Street Conference and beyond the Methodist Church. The church made a decision to become a reconciling church. I was actually not the lead pastor at Grace when they made that decision. It happened the year before I came. And in many ways, I tell the congregation it was something that they were living for a long time before they adopted the language. But they became a reconciling. They voted in their church conference to become a reconciling church in 2010. And then out of that, after the Marriage Equality Act in Maryland passed, and so marriages of all sorts were legal in Maryland, we made a decision to open our sanctuary to any marriage that wanted to happen there with some guidelines that I'm going to show you in a second. And it was for us a very natural outgrowth, but we also we had a 6-week study where we really delved into some of the scriptural witnesses and what we believed in our marriage, and how we felt a sense of calling to open the doors of the church wider. Is our marriage policy? And I'm going to read it. It's not, just so you can see all of it. We believe every person is made in the image of God. As a reconciling congregation, we recognize the sacred worth and dignity of all persons and affirm our call to extend God's grace to all. We believe marriage is a sacred covenant made between two individuals before God and a gathered congregation. When two persons journey towards marriage, they often sense God's Spirit at work in their lives and look to the church to bless their wedding. We pray that those who choose to marry at Grace experience through our witness God's blessing upon their union and our congregation's support. Weddings at Grace are conducted in a Christian marriage in which the couple commit to that lifelong faithfulness, love, forbearance, and mutual comfort. To that end, premarital conversations and adherence to Grace's guidelines are expected. We believe that we're called to recognize and celebrate the faithful commitments made by any two persons who come to Grace to be married. Answering this call, the congregation at Grace affirms the church is open and its ministers are available for weddings of all couples ready to make this sacred covenant. Reverend Jim sent me some of the pieces that you all are working through, and they're very similar. I know some of the similarities in them. But this is where we are. We've been in this space since 2015. So I've covered a lot there, but I'm done, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk about any piece of this. I appreciate your quiet, attentive, your very attentive. Yes?
So, what were the repercussions? This goes against what the Methodist Church is demanding of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, what repercussions?
You had none.
They just let you do it.
So I will. We shared the open marriage policy with our district superintendent, so they are aware of it. No, we have not had any repercussions. And that was something we really talked about. Members of the congregation were really concerned about the risk for pastors. And one of the things that's implied in ours is that Grace has both a senior pastor and an associate pastor. If anyone doesn't feel comfortable doing a wedding, that's totally fine. I was really clear that it was okay with me, that I was willing to take the risk. But we certainly talked through. Well, those are very valid questions to ask, what I'm trying to say, and they need some working through. Any questions? Yeah.
So, how many weddings have you conducted at the church?
So I have actually not conducted any interviews, only because we haven't had any that have been asked of us. We have gotten inquiries, and there are some on my schedule, but COVID, not just COVID, but several different things have made it so that I haven't. I will also tell you that what I have experienced is that being a witness to a very clear sense of welcome in our church on all levels has changed the fabric of the church. And when people come to Grace and we ask them, when a new members class, what drew you to Grace? 90% of the people say our reconciling status. We were looking for a church that was open. She's young.
Did you lose members because they decided to go to the church that
Yes. Did we lose a lot? No. Yeah, I could probably count on one hand. One of the things that's really beautiful about Grace is that we are a diverse congregation, and so, and maybe you know this, but when you sit in a congregation and you have people in your congregation who would love to get married there, and who show up every single week to do the flowers, or make sure the candles are ready, or serve as ushers, but are told they can't get married in this place that they love and have served forever. For us, it became really clear what the right decision was, right? And that one step made it easier to take other steps. Absolutely.
Baltimore, Washington conference where they actually have two different churches, one is reconciling and one is restoring.
The Baltimore Washington Conference is a part of the United Methodist Church. So there is this offshoot that is emerging called the Global Methodist Church or movement. And there, I imagine and know that there will be churches in the Baltimore Washington Conference who choose to leave the conference and align themselves with that new denomination. The conference itself will stay the United Methodist Church. And Jen, you may have shared some of this, but right now they're in the space we are between the special general conference and another general conference. There is kind of a shared understanding that any concerns or charges about doing a wedding or dating someone are really being held in what we call abeyance. They're just really not being prosecuted or brought forward, because we really recognize that there's a wide level of there's just such a big gulf between two sides right? And it's just where we are.
I'm not sure this fits, but I'll ask it. So, right now, your church is reconciling and you're supporting it. You won't be there forever.
Right.
So, what if another minister comes in who disagrees completely? What happens to that?
So a decision to become a reconciling congregation in our church, and I would imagine for most churches, happened at the church conference or the charge conference. So that full meeting, pastors do not vote at that meeting. That's a decision of a church body about who you are and who you want to be. And so a pastor can't come in and change a decision made by a body of Christ. It's also true that our appointment process is a consultative one. And so on every year when Grace fills out its paperwork to give her the DS, it says really clearly, Grace is a reconciling congregation. And these values are deeply important to us. And so district superintendents can know that stuff. Again, it's a great question. You're absolutely, you're thinking about a lot of things, but that would be the assurance I would give. I can tell you're thinking a lot about this. I'm happy to answer questions and
So after you became reconciling, what sort of steps did you take to let that happen?
oh, what a great question. So we put a reconciling sign on our sign outside. So we have a little brick, welcome to Grace Church, yours or something. There's a sign of the reconciling movement that we got, had fast signs create, and we put it on there. We actually, in the wake of General Conference 2019, we put a flag on our front area. And it was for us, again, Grace's congregation is very diverse. It was a ministry to our congregation as well as a witness to the world. This is a space where you are safe. So we did that to kind of communicate it. And we actually wrote a letter to the Baltimore Sun after the 2019 General Conference that was published. So it really kind of said, we disagree with this. This is who we are. And again, you're witnesses to your own congregation, but it's also to the wider community. Like I got phone calls from other people who will never will never come into the door of the church because they're Jewish or they are longtime members of the Episcopal Church up the road who said that mattered to me, right? It's an important witness in our world to what the love of Jesus looks like. We also did some things internally. We started a monthly lunch for anyone who was interested in reconciling ministries. And it became a fellowship time for people who were newer to the church, as well as for people who wanted to be allies, but weren't quite sure how. We celebrate our reconciling status every year on a special Sunday. And more recently, we have begun to attend to or think through not just what reconciling might mean to adults who kind of figured out their identity, maybe trying to live into it, but what it means for everybody from birth to 18. And that's kind of been the newer area for us recently. Another question?
And your flag was a rainbow. Is that correct?
It was a rainbow flag. There's a newer rainbow flag that has a triangle at the front, and so we had the rainbow flag, and then we got the newer one. Is there a question? Okay. Great question. So as far as I understand it, the Reconciling Ministries Network is a United Methodist network that was born out of the experience of the General Conference when the exclusionary language was put into the local discipline. So it is distinctly Methodist. I'm not entirely sure about that though. I'm sure you could find that out on their website. But that's been my experience of this United Methodist. Our Episcopal brothers and sisters, our Lutheran brothers and sisters, our Presbyterian brothers and sisters have actually already gone through this. And they have also had experienced some splinting between made two separate denominations on this issue. So they don't, so you might identify yourself with either branch of the tradition. Do you have a question? I've done a lot of funerals, yes. And I've done funerals for every age and lots of different life stages. It's a privilege to be a funeral, to be present when people are really sad, and to connect somebody to God. Yeah.
In your church, some of us are confused or, I'll speak for myself, with use of pronouns and having to remember which person wants to use which pronouns and all. Is that prevalent within your church? Or just identifying?
I think that's become very prevalent across our society, and it's a way of help of persons seeking to express the fullness of who they are, in part through their gender identity. We certainly have members at Grace who use gender neutral pronouns, who use they and theirs, what I have experienced is that it both means a lot when we reflect that, and use what they've asked us to. And there's also a lot of grace when we mess it up. And I have two children, one is 17 and one is 14. And I've noticed that the use of pronouns matters a lot to our adolescent community. And it's a way of being present to them in their own journeys to adulthood. Isn't most 13, 14, we're all still trying to make our way, but it can be, adolescence can be a time of a lot of questioning.
Just that one of the things that I think your presentation showed is that you made the whole presentation, I think, without using any point. Not by accident.
I mean, there is the piece of,
We don't need them.
you don't, right. When you get to the actual marriage ceremony, our United Methodist one right now is very gendered. And there are scholars who have worked on and created gender neutral ones. But yes, you're right, I did the whole thing about that.
Well, we just went to a wedding where my step-granddaughter married a woman, and they were both brought, and they did not take negative gender at all, or really role at all. It was wonderful,
Yep.
but it was not in the church.
I think the pain for us came in, as I said, when we had members of our congregation who, if the exclusions had not been there, would have very much been married in the church. And that became a space where we said, this does not feel just. It's part of that. I mean, we really came down on that. There's something about it that feels deeply wrong and not in keeping with our Christian tradition and our Christian values. Any other questions? You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. I think I knew I read it. Well, the one thing I would add to that piece what I just said was, as we work through our marriage policy, we kind of debated, do we want, like, there are churches who say you can only get married here if you're a member of this church. And there are other churches that say anyone can get married here so long as they abide by these set of guidelines. And so we had to, and there were very valid reasons for either one. We came on the anyone, we want this to be a space of open. Anyone can get married here. These are our guidelines. As long as you're good with them, you're fine. All right, thank you.